So before we enter into the central programmatic themes of the course, the democratization of the market, the deepening of democracy, and the empowerment of the individual, I want to discuss how the contest over the dictatorship of no alternatives arises in the world today in two particular contexts which I've chosen as examples of the way in which this contest emerges or fails to emerge. The first context is the United States, its history and contemporary situation, and the second context is European social democracy, which is, after all, the default position of the progressives today. My account will be divided into two parts, one historical and critical, and the other the outline of a direction. In other words, the schematic form of a program, of a programmatic response to the experience and to the circumstance that I will have described. And I propose to speak continuously on these two themes, but then to reserve time at the end for our discussion. Now, the very first thing to say is that the most important attribute of this society, the United States, as of my own country, Brazil, is its enormous vitality. An anarchic, restless life that emerges from all parts of the country and from every quarter of social life. And the fundamental question that is presented then is how this precious resource of vitality is to be equipped and shaped so that it not be dissipated in frustrated and fruitless action. The Americans from the outset have had the sense that their country was or is exceptional. This is the famous thesis of American exceptionalism. The United States is, according to this thesis, unlike every other country in the world. And it has a specialness which authorizes it to help show the light, show the way to all of humanity. Now, in that form, the idea of American exceptionalism is mystical and unacceptable. And the first task then in this exposition is to try to define the salvageable empirical content of this idea. If you like, in Marx's phrase, the rational kernel in the mystical shell of the idea of American exceptionalism. And one way to approach, in that spirit, the idea of American exceptionalism is to say that among the rich Western industrial democracies of the North Atlantic world and their outposts around the globe, the United States, on many different dimensions, represents an extreme. So it's an extreme form of characteristics that are common among the advanced societies. And this idea of its extremity is already a first step toward giving a defensible content to the otherwise objectionable idea of American exceptionalism. So, for example, the United States is the most unequal, by far the most unequal of the advanced societies, especially if we compare it to the European social democracies. But despite being the most unequal, it also is the society in whose political culture there is least disposition to view the country as a class society. So it's, in many canonical expressions of American reality, it's supposed to be a classless society. In direct contradiction to the reality that it has a particularly stark form of class hierarchy. The class structure of the United States is very similar to the class structure of the other advanced societies, only more marked than theirs. There is a professional and business class, at the top of which there is a tiny plutocratic elite. Then below the professional and business class, there is a small business class, a petty bourgeoisie, if you like, in the European or Marxist vocabulary. Then there is a working class with a blue collar and a white collar segment. You know the famous American idea of the middle class, which is hard to define sociologically or economically. But if you ask what it means to be a middle class person in the United States, one answer to the question is, it means to be a worker with a bourgeois identity, typically a member of the white collar segment of the working class. And then under this working class, there is an underclass, a large part of which is racially stigmatized, belongs to racial minorities, employed typically in the unstable part of the labor market, the secondary labor market. Insecure, precarious employment, much lower access to the conditions of economic and political agency. So there is a class structure, and in American history, there have been only two major mass episodes of social mobility. By the first of these episodes, the children of small farmers or farmhands became industrial workers, and by the second episode, the children of industrial workers became office workers, the white-collar part of the working class. Now, also, the United States is the most religious of the advanced societies. It is becoming somewhat less religious, and there is a twist to its religiosity, which is the tendency of religion to evolve or degenerate into a kind of halfway house between belief and unbelief, in which the religion is taken to be a collection of metaphors or allegories that are half believed in. And the phenomenon of belief, of faith, becomes, in a sense, more important than the content of the faith itself. The distinctive contribution of the American people to the religious history of humanity does not lie in the traditional organized Christian faiths, Catholic and Protestant, or in the secular humanism, which is to a large extent a secularization of these Christian beliefs. It lies in a third element, which Harold Bloom and others have called the American religion, like Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and various neo-Pentecostal movements. And if you ask what the central idea of this third element in the religious experience of the American people is, it's the notion that the individual is not simply in some correspondence with God, the theomorphic person as the counterpart to an anthropomorphic God, but that in a very real sense the individual is God. He participates in the experience of divinity. He is an emanation of the divine. And in some versions of this theological idea, he is in continuous progression toward the divine. And the continuing strength of this idea in the United States is one of the ways in which the country is remarkable or exceptional among the advanced societies. Now, furthermore, there is an accentuation in the United States of a general characteristic of the advanced societies. The general characteristic is the tendency to abdicate from any attempt to challenge their institutions fundamentally, the way in which the market order is organized and the way in which democracy is organized. And indeed, what I'm calling the default position of the progressives, which is institutionally conservative social democracy, established in Europe and disseminated throughout the world as an example or a model, is characterized by this failure to dispute the established institutional forms of economic and political pluralism, of the market and of democracy. But in the United States, in the culture of the United States, this idea has often been carried to an extreme. And the tendency of the Americans has been to believe that they discovered at the time of the foundation of their republic the definitive form of a free society. It has only to be adjusted at the margin from time to time under the provocation of crisis. And the rest of humanity must either subscribe to this formula or continue to vegetate in poverty and despotism. I've stated it in its extreme and self-confident form. And of course, its supreme expression in the United States is the cult of the Constitution, often regarded as divinely inspired, and unlike all the other constitutions of the world, because in the other countries, the constitutions are changed, even changed a dime a dozen. But in the United States, it's unthinkable to replace the Constitution as Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders, argued that it should be. Jefferson, unbelievably to the Americans who are living now, thought that every 2.5 generations, the Constitution should be trashed and replaced by another one so that the dead wouldn't rule the living. To my mind, an admirable idea, but one that his countrymen, of course, never accepted. So the traditional way in the United States to change the Constitution is not to amend it. The amendment process is difficult and rare. The traditional way to change the Constitution in the United States is to pretend that it means something different from what it was previously thought to mean. And this has been going on forever, since the beginning. Now, this preference for reinterpretation over outright amendment has practical consequences of which maybe the Americans are not fully aware. So it's relatively easy to pretend that the rights provisions of the Constitution mean something different, like equal protection or due process. But it's very difficult to imagine that the provisions for the specific organization of the government don't mean what they seem to say. So, for example, if it says that there are to be 3 branches of government, it's hard to pretend that what it really means is that there should be 5 branches of government. So the preference for reinterpretation over outright amendment tilts the bias of constitutional revision toward the reinterpretation of rights and away from structural changes in the organization of democratic politics. It has practical consequences. So we could go down the list and we would find that in all these ways and many others, the United States is indeed exceptional. But its exceptions are, as it were, accentuations, exaggerations of characteristics that are common among the advanced societies, especially among the rich democracies of the North Atlantic world. This fact is a source of great confusion and tension in the world, because at least until recently, globalization, the organization of a new system, appears to the rest of humanity to be very difficult to distinguish from Americanization. And if the United States is exceptional in all these ways, then all the reasons to object to the specifically American features become objections to globalization. And this then becomes a source of debate and confusion in the world. Now, having dealt with the theme of American exceptionalism in that, as it were, deflationary spirit of bringing it down to earth, the next thing I want to do before I embark on a selective historical interpretation of the making of the United States is to deal with consciousness. The experience, a national experience, is never just a matter of the institutional arrangements, but also of the way in which they are represented, of the ideals, of the form of thinking. As Tocqueville said, every great revolution is both a religious revolution and a political revolution. By religious, he meant having to do with consciousness, and by political, having to do with institutions. So in the United States had, at the crucial moment of its formation, in the early history of the Republic, from the independence to the Civil War, a series of exemplary leaders and teachers. We call them prophets. People like Abraham Lincoln, like Emerson, like Whitman, who proposed a view of what was essential to the American project, to the American experiment. And so I now want to ask the question, what was the message of the American prophets? And the perspective from which I ask this question is quite different from the way in which this message is ordinarily taken in the United States. The general procedure is to say, we should hearken to the message of the American prophets. We should hear it in order to implement it. The problem is that the message has not been enacted. But I think that the problem is not just that the message hasn't been enacted, that the message was defective, even as it came out of the mouths of the prophets. And therefore, on this view, the task is simultaneously to correct the message with respect to what I will claim to be its defects, and then to enact it in its corrected form. So the message was intimately associated with this third form of Christianity, which I just described as a distinctive contribution of the Americans to the religious evolution of humanity. The individual is divinity incarnate, and he shares in the inner life of God. To change the vocabulary, the individual is spirit, embodied spirit. Embodied spirit takes a form, an earthly form, in the organized context of social life, but there is always more in the spirit than there is in these contexts. So the spirit spills over and has the potential of transgression and transcendence. And this individual now, to replace the theological vocabulary by a secular one, is like a little Napoleon who crowns himself. Emerson said, imitation is suicide. So self-construction, self-fashioning is the essential American project, requiring the rejection of the mimetic characteristics of social life. Now, I want to say that from the very outset, this idea, this message, the individual is God. The individual becomes more human by becoming more godlike, meaning not by increasing his share in the divine attributes of omnipotence and omniscience, but by increasing his share in the divine attribute of transcendence. This idea from the outset bore the mark of two taints, of two defects. The first defect was a disturbance in the understanding of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. So the idea is the individual makes himself, he lifts himself up, being, as it were, already by his very nature, a fragment of God. And then, as a result of this lifting up, he can cooperate with the other gods, the other humans. He can be generous, he can practice philanthropy, he can cooperate. But it's as if the connection or the cooperation came after the lifting up, the empowerment. And the defect then on this account is failing to do justice to the sense in which solidarity is internal to self-construction. And the same idea can be phrased in the language of the contradictory character of our self-construction. To build himself, the person has to connect with others. Unless he connects with others, he is not free. But every connection threatens him with subjugation and loss of personal distinction. And so there's a contradiction in the presuppositions of self-fashioning. It requires connection, but connection places the individual agent and his project of making himself more human by making himself more godlike in jeopardy. So to be free, the individual must be capable of attenuating this contradiction. In other words, he must succeed in diminishing the price that connection exacts by way of subjugation or loss of personal distinction. And to the extent that he succeeds in diminishing this price and reconciling these contradictory requirements of self-assertion, he becomes free. So there has to be a different way of understanding the relation between the making of the self and this connection in society. The second defect has to do with the relation of the individual to the social world in which he participates. And that too can be framed as a contradiction in the presuppositions of personal agency. To be free, the individual must participate in a real social world. No one is free living in the wilderness, in the forest, alone. But every engagement in a particular world threatens to exact, as the price of this engagement, surrender to that world. So then the question of freedom becomes, how can we engage without surrendering? How can it be that we can participate in a particular world, but in the very act of participating in it, continue to resist it, to criticize it, to attack it, to transcend it? In other words, to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And if that is to happen, then the institutions of the democracy and of the market must be susceptible to revision. Contrary to the premises of classical liberal thought, there is no neutral set of economic and political arrangements. There is no impersonal set of rights, of economic and political rights, that we can say is neutral with respect to the sectarian goods that we seek. The central premise of classical liberal theory is the distinction between the impersonal right and the sectarian good. Because every institutional order tilts the scales and encourages some forms of experience, of pursuit of the good, and discourages others. So the idea of neutrality is, on this view, an illusion, and a dangerous illusion, because neutrality is always invoked to achieve the opposite. In other words, to entrench, to immunize against attack a set of arrangements. But nevertheless, this false idea of neutrality has a kinship to another idea which is valid and even indispensable. And the other idea is that social life should be open to a wide set of contradictory experience, and above all, that it should be corrigible. So we should have the instruments to change it. And if it has this characteristic of being both contradictory and revisable, then we stand a better chance on this view of engaging in it without surrendering to it, a better chance of achieving another kind of freedom. So there you have, as it were, the elementary schema of a certain way of criticizing the message of the American prophets and of complicating what they recommended. Incompatible with the false view of the relation between self-construction and solidarity, and incompatible as well with the institutional idolatry, the view that there is a natural and uncontested form of the free society. And this observation then is of great significance to us today for the following reason, which I hope will become of greater I hope it will become clearer later on in the argument of the course. Like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we now have reason to recognize the primacy of structural or institutional change over non-structural or non-institutional change. The default progressive position, institutionally conservative social democracy, has no structural content. Its specialization is compensatory redistribution, the humanization of the established order. Structural content always has primacy. One kind of market as against another, one kind of democracy as against another, and so forth. However, unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we also have reason not to entrust our futures to dogmatic institutional blueprints, as they did. So each faction of liberalism or socialism had a dogmatic institutional prescription: establish the system of liberal rights, give command to the state, and so on and so forth. And the truth seems to be, following on something that I said a moment ago, that there is no definitive institutional form, that all of these institutional forms are ephemeral and flawed, fallible, and therefore one of their most important attributes is that they must invite and facilitate their own revision in the light of experience, which is the attribute of experimentalism. Well, so much for the message of the American prophets and the critique of it, the critique of the message. Now, the next thing that I want to do is to present a view, once again, extremely schematic, of the making of the United States in the early 19th century, the period between independence and the Civil War, the same period in which these American prophets were acting and speaking and propounding this message which I have just described and criticized. Because what actually made the United States is very different from the way in which American experience is ordinarily interpreted, especially today, in a sense, by this kind of Whiggish history. All of American history is sometimes seen as a kind of prelude to identity politics and the civil rights movement. But the making of the United States has to do with something very different. And I'm now going to describe in brief the central dynamic which I believe to have been responsible for the construction of the country in its early history, against the terrible background of African slavery, founded on violence. So we're talking about the part of the country in which slavery was not absolutely predominant. In the South it was predominant, but in the North, when Tocqueville visited it, it was essentially a society of small-scale proprietors, artisans, craftsmen. In the 1830s, at the time of Tocqueville's visit, only one white American in 5 worked for another white American. So almost everyone who was not a slave or an indentured servant was an independent, small-scale entrepreneur, proprietor, farmer of one kind or another. Now, what did the Americans do then to build their country? At the top, in the movement from the top down, there was a developmental project. It was Hamilton's project. Hamilton was the major ideologist of the American national construction. And all the presidents of the United States, down through Abraham Lincoln, regarded themselves as disciples of Hamilton. And this was a project of literally building the country, opening it up with roads, with canals. Later came railroads. There was a heavy barrier of protection, trade protection, and which continued until the second decade of the 20th century. The United States was one of the most protectionist economies in the world. The Bank of the United States, the first and then the second national banks of the United States, were organized and became the instrument of this nascent entrepreneurial plutocracy, whose business was inseparable from the business of the state. And there was a clique of politicians, entrepreneurs, speculators, diplomats who were involved in this construction. Now, if that is all that had happened in the United States, this Hamiltonian project on top, the United States would not have become what it became. This movement from on top interacted with a very different kind of movement coming from below that I want to describe as a selective democratization of the economy in what were then the two crucial sectors of agriculture and finance. So in agriculture, the Americans rejected what both the liberals and the Marxists came to believe was the inevitable dynamic of agrarian concentration. The independent peasants or farmers would be forced out of the land into the cities. Great land holdings would be established, entrepreneurial land holdings, and the former peasants would become then the base from which the new industrial labor force of the 19th century would be recruited. The Americans said no. They distributed the lands on the public frontier, on the agrarian frontier, through the Homestead Acts, and they organized what in a contemporary vocabulary we would describe as decentralized strategic coordination between the government, national government and local government, and the family farmer. So first it had a scientific or cultural basis. The land-grant colleges were established, and a system of agricultural extension that brought the discoveries of agricultural science to the individual farmer. And agriculture was secured against its unique problem, which is the combination of price volatility with climate volatility. Economic risk and physical risk is what historically almost always ends up undermining family farming. So they organized price supports, food stockpiles, agricultural income insurance, crop insurance, and so forth. To secure this decentralized agricultural market. This was on the horizontal axis between the government and the farmer. And on the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, among the farmers, they promoted what in today's vocabulary we would describe as cooperative competition. The farmers continued to compete against one another, but they also pooled resources. They worked on one another's land. They shared silos, and later they shared machines to achieve economies of scale. And the result of this combination of decentralized strategic partnership and cooperative competition was to create the most productive form of family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial attributes that had ever existed in the world. Now, in finance, they undertook similar innovations. The National Bank, the Bank of the United States, I said, had been the public debt has been used to help finance the Hamiltonian project. But in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the Americans dissolved the National Bank. And for over 100 years, they prohibited any bank from operating in more than one state of the Union. They created the most decentralized system of credit at the disposal of the local producer, not just the local consumer, that had ever existed in the world. Only at the end of the 19th century, the New York banks started de facto to become national banks before the formal legal restrictions were lifted. When the Americans were doing what I just described in agriculture and in finance, they were not doing either of the two things that we now conventionally think can be done with the market economy. They were not regulating the agricultural or financial market, and they were not redistributing after the fact the gains of market activity in order to attenuate inequalities, compensatory and retrospective redistribution. They were doing a third thing. They were reshaping the institutional and legal architecture of the market. They were redefining what the market was, rather than regulating it or attenuating its inequalities. And throughout the course, I'm going to argue that this third thing is much more important than either of those other things. Much more important for economic growth and much more important for equality. And that's what the Americans were doing. Now then, so the thesis is this combination of the selective democratization in particular sectors with the developmental mobilization of national resources on top, the project of national development, was really what made the United States in this early period. But there were two problems which prevented the recurrence of this favorable dialectic later on. So the first problem was the weakness of thought, of understanding. What I just described as the inner principle of these sectoral innovations in agriculture and in finance was never made explicit. They were never seen explicitly as species of this reshaping of the market order. And in fact, the doctrines that came to prevail in the United States, in the public discussion of the economy, and now in social science and policy discourse, assume to a greater or lesser extent that the market order has a natural and necessary form. The thesis that in the first class I label market fundamentalism. So there was no contest established in the crucial disciplines of understanding that would interpret and radicalize the idea that was implicit in the agricultural and financial experiments of the early 19th century. And the second defect was the defect of politics, of democracy. The American democracy was, like all the democracies that exist in the world, but even more so than many of them, a weak democracy, a kind of proto-democratic liberalism, which was designed by Madison and his contemporaries to inhibit the transformative uses of politics. That was part of the constitutional arrangements, to establish a kind of correspondence between the transformative ambition of any political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that we have to overcome in order to be implemented. So the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power was married to the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. And it was not by accident, but by intention, by design. Part of the purpose was to prevent the state, the government, democratic politics, from disturbing the economic order. So this combination became weaker and weaker in the Reconstruction, in the progressivism of the early 20th century and later on. And the two dominant reform traditions in American life were, on the one hand, the defense of the small producer against the big producer, small business against big business. It's the tradition that goes from Jefferson to Brandeis. And on the other hand, the idea that it's natural for big business to control the commanding heights of the economy, but it then has to be subject to strong regulatory control by the federal government. That was the progressivist idea of the early 20th century and of the first Roosevelt. So both these reform traditions presupposed the idea of the naturalness of the market order. Now let's look far ahead to the most significant episode of institutional experimentation in American history, institutional experimentation with the market, which was Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And in giving an account of the meaning of the New Deal, we must interpret it in a way that avoids idealizing or sentimentalizing it. Because in fundamental ways, the New Deal is not a model for what would have to be done today to develop a progressive alternative in the United States. So we can distinguish four moments in the evolution of the New Deal. There was first the early institutional experimentalism. It was just the first year and a half of Roosevelt's experience in power in the presidency. And this was the period, for example, of the National Industrial Recovery Program, which was subsequently invalidated constitutionally. The content of these early experiments was not peculiarly American. Roosevelt intended to be a radical experimentalist, but everyone is at the mercy of the ideas that are available to him. So it's a characteristic mistake of the politician. The politician thinks he'll come to power, and when he wants ideas, they'll appear. But they don't appear when you want them. And the stock of ideas available at the world at any given time is relatively inelastic. So you can call the spirits, but they may not come. And this is what happened. So the content of the institutional experiments that Roosevelt enacted was very similar to the experiments being tried out in Europe. And including, and even more so, in the fascist and Nazi regimes. So there were two main characteristics. The first was the direct employment of people by the government, the Works Project Administration. You just employed people directly. In teams of workers, the employer of last resort was the state. And the second was what, in today's vocabulary, we would describe as corporatism, managed competition. the restabilization of the economy, which was in free fall, through licensed oligopolies or cartels and price supports. Not the democratization of the economy, not the diffusion of widespread economic empowerment. This corporatist restabilization of the economy, which the government partnered with big business to limit competition and restabilize the markets on the basis of oligopolies and cartels and price controls or price supports of many different kinds. Then, in the second moment of the New Deal, from, say, the middle of 1934 to the war, the focus of the New Deal narrowed from these broader but limited institutional experiments to the provision of antidotes against economic insecurity. And the signal program that represented this was, of course, the Social Security program. Institutional experimentation persisted in certain limited sectors, most notably the housing market, the creation of the quasi-governmental organizations, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that then organized a mortgage market and then later on a secondary mortgage market, which was the main source of the deepening and democratization of finance in the United States. And now if we jump ahead from the second stage to the fourth stage, the fourth stage is the democratization of consumption. So the attempt to reinvent the market was abandoned. The antidotes to economic insecurity were left in place, but not further developed or radicalized. And the formula of economic growth from the end of the war to after the war became growth based on consumption. Vulgar Keynesianism, funding consumption, and made possible by the democratization not of property, but of credit. So rather than a property-owning democracy, a kind of fake credit democracy. That was, by the way, part of the run-up to the financial crisis of 2008. The multiplication of financial instruments derivatives and speculative instruments in which the background was the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral and the extension of leverage by both households and secondarily firms. Franklin Roosevelt was asked at the end of the second book, a little before his death, what book he would like to see in the hands of every Soviet child. And they thought he would say the Holy Bible. But he answered the Sears Roebuck catalog. And this was, I think, a frank expression of what became the driving principle of economic growth. Now, I didn't say anything about the third stage. And that third stage is one of the most interesting episodes in American history, the war economy. So, when the Americans entered the Second World War, they decided to run the economy on principles that were in frontal violation to their supposedly sacrosanct economic dogmas. as if those dogmas were just a mask that they could cast aside. So a free-flowing coordination, a flexible coordination between big business and the government to produce armaments at great scale rapidly. The total volume of military procurements in the first 6 months of 1942 was greater than the whole GDP of the United States in 1941. So this is a vast operation in which there were two crucial elements. One was large-scale resource mobilization, physical resources, financial resources, and human resources, combined with radical institutional experimentation, which was never formalized, through this dialogic form of coordination between government, the government at war, and big business. The Congress tried to introduce small business into this through the Small Business Act, but failed. So one could have one could imagine a war economy without a war. But of course, this was never an idea that occurred to anyone. The war economy was not taken as a model for the reorganization of the peacetime economy. It was taken as a completely exceptional anomaly, totally restricted to the unique conditions of wartime. But what was the result? In 4 years, from 1942 to 1945, 3 years actually, the GDP of the United States more than doubled. That's sensational. And things happened in the conduct of the war that were unimaginable today to the Americans who are living now. So for example, the top marginal rate of the personal income tax at one point exceeded 90%. This is a confiscatory tax, total national mobilization. So the Americans were supposedly devoted to this idea of the free market and the natural form of market fundamentalism. But when they needed to, they threw it all away and did things completely differently. So this is a remarkable demonstration that more things are possible than seem to be possible. And their essential strength was this capacity to cooperate, regardless of the institutional background. And what do we have now in the recent period? We have nothing like any of this. Not like the war economy, not like the Rooseveltian institutional corporatist experiment, not like the early 19th century combination of national mobilization on top and selective democratization below, which in a way of all of these episodes that I've recounted would be the most pertinent to contemporary experience. The progressives in the United States on the whole have no progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. Basically, they have only a distributivist project and a project of inclusion and diversity. And the programs of the state, of the government, almost all of them involve upward redistribution to the large corporate interests. The idea of many of the progressives, including the progressive economists, seems to be that the United States should become, if they could have their way, what they imagine to be the Sweden of the 1970s. not the real Sweden. So, and here let me introduce a side comment. So, if the world could vote to choose a regime, a form of life, it wouldn't vote to be the United States, it would vote to be Sweden. It's the most popular regime in the world. Scandinavian social democracy. But there's a confusion because in the real Sweden, Sweden was a peasant society that became rich. And in the early decades of the 20th century, there was intense conflict over access to economic and political power. There was a dynastic plutocracy in Sweden, which continues to hold most of the assets. A small number of families owns a large part of the economy. But the state confiscated part of their power and achieved an understanding or a compromise with them that was compatible with the aspirations of the social democratic state of sustaining a high level of redistributive social entitlements. So the world sees this epilogue of the redistributive entitlements, but it doesn't see the prologue of all those decades of fighting over the organization of political and economic power. And so it wants, as it were, only this phony Sweden, what came at the end, but not this compromise with the plutocrats, which created a space for the social democratic state in Sweden. So there is no productivist project now, no progressive approach to the supply side of the economy, as there has been in many earlier moments of American history, especially in the early 19th century. And even more so, there's no institutional project for the reshaping of political and economic institutions. Now I'm going to go on to the second part of my argument briefly, which is then just to outline in the broadest terms the elements of a project that would act on the lessons of this American experience that I've just summarized. And that would act in the direction of the kind of left, of the kind of progressive force that I invoked in the first class, in which, remember, the aim is to become bigger together. And the method is to experiment with the limits of the established institutional structure, which I call radical reform. Not the revolutionary substitution of one system for another, but the piecemeal and cumulative transformation of parts of the regime, the economic regime and the political regime. So I'm going to describe some of the components of such a project. Now, when I describe them, it may seem to you that I'm talking about them as if they formed a system, but they don't form a system. It's not like, for example, Marx's idea of the modes of production, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. You have it all at once or you don't have it at all. Everything is indispensably connected to everyone else. That's not how it is. In these structures that exist, indeed the different parts of the structure reinforce each other. But they always change piecemeal in some fragmentary form. You change a part, and then you advance until you hit against the limit imposed by the failure to change something else. And then you turn to the something else. So it's a process of combined and uneven development in which the sequence of transformation is determined less by any objective sense of priority, of importance, but by circumstance, of what is most available to be challenged and changed in a particular national context at a particular time. So in this spirit then, let me describe the first element is then the democratization of the market order with respect especially to the particular goal of opening up access to the most advanced practice of production. So there is a change in the regime of production. Industrial mass production has been replaced by what we call the knowledge economy, or the innovation economy, or the experimentalist economy. It's not just the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. It's not just advanced manufacture. It exists in every part of the production system, but in every part of the production system it exists only as a fringe, a set of islands that exclude the large majority of workers and of firms. So this exclusionary or insular character of the new vanguardism then becomes the driving force of both massive inequality and economic slowdown. So how could there not be slowdown if we deny to the vast majority of the labor force and of the firms the most productive practice? And inequality then is anchored in this hierarchical segmentation of the production system. There's an abyss that becomes deeper and deeper, separating the vanguard from everything else, the rear guards. Rather than being disseminated to the whole economy, the people in charge of the vanguard discover a way to bifurcate the process of production. The most creative and lucrative part they keep for themselves, often without any physical apparatus. It's fabless. And then the commoditized or formulaic part, they subcontract to firms and workers in other parts of the world, characteristically in precarious employment. And that then becomes the dominant form of production. Everyone else in the societies, to exaggerate, is condemned to some kind of make work. So there's an elite of technologists, of entrepreneurs, who are in this advanced sector, and everyone else is left behind. Now, the simple idea, the idea is that there is no measure of compensatory redistribution that could deal with this problem, because the compensatory redistribution would have to be massive. And long before it reached the requisite dimension to cancel out the inequalities resulting from these structural disparities in the production system, it would begin to disturb or annul the arrangements and incentives of this private economy. So all it can do is attenuate inequality at the margin. It can't change the reality that results from these structural disparities. So what would then the project have to be? The project would have to be to try and lift up the vanguard, to bring it closer to the, lift up the rear guard, to bring it closer to the vanguard. And there are two targets, there are two different targets. They're the relatively retrograde, small and medium-sized firms of the economy that are left back in the dust. And then there are the individual agents who may have no connection with business organizations, with firms. They're relatively separated, like nurse practitioners, machine repair people, and so forth, they too have to be lifted up. And they have to be lifted up by some counterpart to the 19th century agricultural extension. That is, it's not that they are to be subsidized, but the government then, on this view, would have to make the advanced practices and technologies accessible, available to a much wider cast of economic characters. To identify which experiments in the attempt to do this work best, and then to disseminate them. And this would be only the first stage, because much later would have to come innovations in the regime of property and contract, that is, in the basic legal architecture of the market order. But the fundamental principle is that one. It's this principle of having a productivist aim to lift up the rear guard and bring it closer to the vanguard. And of course, this project in the economy would have to have also a corollary to deal with the relations between labor and capital. Now a large part of the labor force in the United States and around the world is in unstable and precarious employment. And the remedies of the 20th century of countervailing power of unionization are not adequate to deal with that problem because these workers are disorganized. So there has to be a legal regime for this reality, a way of mastering it, which distinguishes the legitimate aim of economic flexibility, always the mantra of neoliberalism in the labor markets, from the illegitimate objective of simply cheapening the returns to labor. And there would have to be another corollary to this project having to do with the relation of finance to the real economy. In the current system, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms, and finance, to a large extent, has a parasitic relation to the productive agenda of society, using the transactions of the real economy as pretexts rather than as true objects. And this too would have to be the object of an intervention. So there's one space, one part of a project. Now, and you can imagine it beginning in little pieces. It's not all or nothing. It's capable of small marginal advances. Now then the second project is the creation of a high energy democracy. A high energy democracy defined as a democracy that doesn't need crisis in the form of economic collapse or war to make change possible, that renders the impulse to transformation endogenous, internal to society. A high-energy democracy depends then at least on three sets of institutional arrangements. First, it depends on arrangements that heighten the level of organized, popular participation in political life. Let's call that the temperature of politics, political mobilization. The premise of conservative political science and political statecraft is that politics, democratic politics, must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional, as in Caesarism, populist leaders, demagogues, and so forth. But this excludes, of course, what is most vital, which is the possibility that politics can be both hot and institutional, depending on the rules that govern the relation of politics to the media, the relation of politics to money, the electoral systems, whether the vote is optional or mandatory, and so forth. So The first objective is to raise the temperature, the level of organized engagement. The second objection has to do with the setup of the government. As I said, the American constitutional architecture marries a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power to a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. What would you want as a progressive? You would want to reaffirm the liberal principle but to reject the conservative one. And how would you do it? There are any number of ways in which you could do it. For example, you could say, if there's an impasse between the two political branches, either branch can break the impasse by calling anticipated elections, which, however, would always be for both branches. So that the constitutional arrangements provide a formula for the acceleration of politics. The point is not to perpetuate impasse, as Madison wanted. The point is to resolve it quickly as possible. And then the third principle has to do with the relation between strong central action and radical devolution. There's parts of the society, of the country, under certain conditions designed to prevent abuse, to prevent discrimination, to prevent self-dealing, should be able to apply for the ability to diverge from the predominant solutions. Some form of legal secession. So that as the country goes down a certain path, it hedges its bets by allowing different parts of itself to embody alternative versions of the national future. So there's a dialectic of alternatives represented in the political life of the nation. And the first step of this re-energizing of federalism is then cooperation within the federation to experiment. Vertical cooperation among the three levels of the federation and horizontal cooperation among the states and the municipalities. The general view of the American progressives is that the place to start is the second of these three elements. That's the first of these three elements, the rules governing money and media and so forth. I think this is a mistake myself. And then the natural place to stop is the third, the reinvention of American federalism, because it appeals broadly across right and left to a large part of the country in the service of democratic experimentalism. Now then, so the first project is to democratize the market economy, and especially to democratize access to the most advanced practice of production. The second project is to create a high-energy democracy, rich in structural fecundity, in the ability to generate alternative structures. So a form of organized democratic experimentalism in the way that I've just described. The third project is to establish the basis of social cohesion. Under institutionally conservative social democracy, the basis of social cohesion, you see this in Europe clearly, is money transfers organized by the state against a background of a high level of ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity. So when the level of homogeneity degrades, because, for example, of migratory flows in Europe, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes manifest. There is only one possible practical basis of social solidarity or social cohesion, which is people doing things together. Cooperation, and cooperation especially of different people. The multiplication of forms of collective action is the real basis of social cohesion in the advanced societies. Now, where is this to take place? For example, in the organization of education, if it become cooperative. In the way in which public services are provided. So you could have the following idea of the provision of public services. The state provides a universal floor, a minimum of universal public services. And the state may also operate at the ceiling in the provision of the most advanced and costliest services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state partners with independent civil society. It's not the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. It's the organization of civil society to participate together with the state in the cooperative and experimental provision of public services, not for profit. Cooperatives of health workers, of education workers, and so forth. After all, public services build civil society, so civil society comes to life, building itself, forming its own future in cooperation with the state. The state finances, the state equips, the state monitors, and the state works with civil society in the provision of public services. And then there's national service. So all the advanced societies in the North Atlantic world have now abolished conscript armies, with only one or two exceptions, with a tiny number of exceptions, like Switzerland. And conscript armies are subversive of republican institutions. So when you have a conscript army, you abolish one of the central premises of a republic, which is the army is not part of the country paid for by the other parts to defend them. The army is the nation in arms. Every citizen is a soldier. That's one of the essential bases of a republic. Not just the high energy democracy that I described, but any republic. Other than that, you have an army of poor people to fight wars for rich people, an anti-republican arrangement. And then you could say, because not everyone is needed, that all the young men and women who were dispensed from mandatory military service become subject to mandatory civil service. And they have to go work in part of the country to help build the country. And that's cooperation on a massive scale. And so that's the real basis of cohesion in society. Direct engagement with people in other people's lives beyond the boundaries of family selfishness. Now I come to the fourth element in this project, which is empowerment through education. So all of these elements, which I've just described, you could consider them a way to loosen a storm of innovation in society, of experiment. But for this innovation to be fertile and tolerable, for it not to inspire fear and insecurity, the individual has to be secure and capable in a haven of vital protected interests. Institutionally conservative social democracy only has the part about the haven. It doesn't have the part about the storm. So there's a haven, but there's no storm. But in truth, the haven is for the sake of the storm. So let me give you an analogy, a homely analogy, a familiar analogy. The parent says to the child, I love you. I love you unconditionally. Independently of anything you do or say, you are secure in my love. Now, go out and raise a storm in the world. That should be the relation of parental love to the child. Now, this is what I'm imagining as the general principle in the organization of society. The individual must be made secure, unafraid, and capable in a haven of vital safeguards and endowments. so that he can act and thrive in the midst of innovation all around him, rather than allow his security to depend on the rigidity of the surrounding social space. And one of the elements in this haven is, of course, education. So we have to ask, what kind of education should there be under a democracy? The school in a democracy should not be the instrument of the state saying, serve me, and it should not be the instrument of the family which says to the child, become like me. The school should be the voice of the future. And the school should recognize in every young person a tongue-tied prophet and equip him. That's the mission of the school under democracy. An impossible mission, because the real forces that are established in the world are these: the state, the family. So the school has to throw one against the other and establish a space in which it can carry out its program of emancipation and enlightenment. In a country that is large, very unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States or like my country, Brazil, the initial practical problem of the institutional setting of education is how to reconcile the local management of the schools by the towns and the states with national standards of investment in quality. So the quality of education the young person receives must not depend on the happenstance of the place in which he was born or the people to whom he was born. It must be a national standard. So in order to reconcile local management with national standards, there are three requirements. The first requirement is a national system of evaluation by school and by student to see what happens. The second requirement is a mechanism of redistribution, to redistribute resources and people from richer places to poorer places in the Federation. And the third element is a provision of corrective intervention when, despite all efforts, a local school system fails repeatedly to reach the minimum threshold of quality. So then you need to have an equivalent to the recovery of a failing business in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. There needs to be a trans-federal structure, federal cooperation, to take over the local failing school system, to delegate its management to independent experts, to rebuild it, and then to return it once it's been rebuilt. So let's say that's the background. But then you have to ask, and what is the model, the pedagogic paradigm of teaching and learning? I will now describe it in its essential elements. So the first, and it applies to both general education and technical education. So the model most imitated in the world of technical education is the old German model. You train to be an electrician, a plumber. You know the repertoire of traditional lathes and metal cutting machines. That's the traditional model. So you're trained. The elites are trained as generalists, and the masses, the workers, are trained as specialists through this model of technical education. But now, technical education and general education are on a continuum. Technical education focuses on higher order conceptual and practical capabilities. The capabilities required for the deployment and use of numerically controlled machine tools, the numerically controlled machine tools of the knowledge economy. And this is on a continuum with the characteristic of the general education that one should desire. So first, it should be focused on the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the imagination. The way we understand anything in nature or in society is by understanding how it changes. Its possible transformations. If we don't understand its transformations, we don't understand it at all. We just stare at it. And all of our explanations are just post-fact rationalizations. So we need to have the analytic and synthetic tools for insight into transformation of everything we study. It's not the study, the passive study of the encyclopedia. The best student is not the student who has memorized the encyclopedia. Now, second, the acquisition of these analytic and synthetic capabilities cannot be achieved in a vacuum of content. It has to be achieved dealing with content. But with respect to content, what matters is not encyclopedic scope. What matters is selective depth. So the form of education has to be thematic or project-oriented. Third, the social setting of education has to be cooperative. That's the method of advanced science, cooperation. Cooperation between teachers and students, among students, among teachers, and among schools, rather than the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism, which characterizes traditional schooling. And finally, the fourth attribute, education must be dialectical. Nothing can be taught just once. Everything must be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. This is the only way to liberate the mind. And the only way to immunize the young against the orthodoxies of the university culture, which they will encounter later on. So there you have a short schematic account of an American progressive project. And its themes are the general themes of the course, and I will keep coming back to at many different levels. But they are all informed or animated by the historical interpretation, which I gave in the first part of the course. It's not as if the Americans didn't do versions of this all before. They did it on a smaller scale with respect to specific sectors, but they did it. They already demonstrated that they're not the slaves of these dogmas, and that when they needed to, they could cast the dogmas off. And so this project is designed to take seriously the central idea of democracy, which is faith in the constructive ingenuity of ordinary men and women. Now there I stop and invite your engagement. I'm sorry to have occupied all of this time with this long exposition, but I felt it was important to give a coherent, organized account, historical, critical, and programmatic. So there's at least a fleshed out model of what a programmatic argument looks like. Yes?
So, yeah, on the dichotomy of self-destruction versus solidarity,
Yes.
you mentioned that build oneself is necessary to connect others, but every connection trapped in a loss. So I was wondering what kind of social contract is implicit on this idea that every single connection can embrace a feeling of loss.
So let's be clear about what the nature of the loss is. So the idea is we can be free only if we connect. But if we connect, we're threatened with subjugation or loss of personal distinction in some form. So the question is, how can we connect without being subjugated? Now, in intimate life, we have an experience of connection without subjugation. It's love. But love is not a solution among strangers, although we are commanded to love the stranger. So we need a proxy, a surrogate for love in life among strangers. The proxy for love in life among strangers is cooperation among free and equal individuals. And of course, contrary to the thesis of market fundamentalism, the institutional forms of cooperation are all disputable. They're the object of the contest in history. So then we have this contest. The existing form of cooperation is not good enough. Here's another one that's better. But a way to understand this is then that the message of the prophets, we are God. We become more human by becoming more godlike. This message has to be enacted in the world, and the inaction is troubled. So there's this contradiction in the presuppositions of self-construction as this first contradiction. And so one dimension of this contradiction is then political. So we have to reorganize the economy or politics so that they are more acceptable images of this idea of cooperation, rather than the defective forms that they now have. But of course, these political projects are not projects that take place, that succeed or fail in the dimension of a human lifetime. They're projects that take place in history. And we don't live in historical time. We live in biographical time. So we don't control our relation to our moment in history. And therefore, it's not enough to have a political idea. We also need to have a moral idea, an idea of how to live, which then is another dimension of these discussions, the conduct of life. Not an object of our conversation in this course, but, and then you would say, one of the roles of moral thinking is to make up for the failures of politics. Given that we don't live in where we should live, what do we do in the meantime in our own lives and so forth? That's the kind of argument. Yes?
Under the Hamiltonian project, you described how American reform or the reformation in agriculture and finance happened. But you observe of two problems that the weakness of thoughts and the weakness of politics.
Louder, please.
And you observe of two defects there, the weakness of thoughts and weakness in democracy or in politics.
Yes.
So how this weak democracy helped America later to grow as a stronger nation in the world?
Well, what I'm saying is that this combination of the Hamiltonian developmentalism on top and the selective sectoral democratization below was vulnerable in both these ways. It was vulnerable to superstitions and ideas and to the weakness of democracy. And as a result, it became weaker and weaker in American history. And corporate power entered the vacuum, right? And the marriage of corporate power to government filled the space as a result. So that wasn't the end of attempts to reestablish, to reform the structure. Because then there was the intervention of the great ally of transformation, which is crisis. So Franklin Roosevelt had as his allies the greatest war that ever happened in the world, the Second World War, and the greatest economic collapse, the Depression of the 1930s. And so it was possible, to a limited extent, to retake the agenda of alternatives, thanks to crisis. So one of the themes of the programmatic arguments here in this course is how can we create economic institutions, and especially political institutions, that don't depend on crisis to make change possible. And of course, one of the paradoxes, conundrum, is that the introduction of these institutions that don't depend on crisis to make change possible itself seems to depend on crisis. So that's a cycle that we have to break. And one of the ways that we break that cycle is through the imagination. Because as I said in the very first class, the work of the task of the imagination is to do the work of crisis without crisis. Otherwise we have to wait. You know, in one of these writings that I assign, I cite Tolstoy's War and Peace. So in Tolstoy's War and Peace, one of the protagonists, Pierre, remember, looks up to the sky and he sees Halley's Comet. And he understands that Halley's Comet is a presage of the invasion of Napoleon. And Napoleon will come to Russia, he will invade Russia, and everyone's life will be thrown up into the air. Everyone will be lifted from the rut of normal existence. And that's what happens when there's crisis. So then, rather than the long littleness of life, there's going to be the real thing, struggle at a higher level. The terrible sacrifices and devotions of war that Tolstoy describes. Now, what about us? So suppose our lives happen to have fallen in a long period of restless, imperfect peace in between the visits of this comet. This is a problem of the divergence of biographical and historical time. So, do we have to wait for the comet to come again in the form of war, in the form of crisis, in order to have a hope of transformation? Or can we somehow make up for the delay in the visit of the comet? This is a direct question for us, for our historical situation. So this is how I think about my own situation. I think I happen to have been born in a counter-revolutionary interlude in a long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. I don't want my actions or ideas to be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude, because I want this world revolution to continue. I understand that to continue it has to be reinvented. It can't have the same content, it can't have the same form, and so forth. But I want it to continue. So this is the problem that we face. And I don't think we should treat this as a problem out there about other people, like the Americans of the 19th century or something. It's a problem for us. It's a problem about us. It is, in a sense, the central problem. Yes?
Hi. So the real question that I want to ask Eva Warren is very flat-footed. I'll try to ask a clarificatory question as well to maybe make it a little bit less flat-footed. But, well, early in the talk you said that it's a premise of classical liberal thought that there's no impersonal set of economic or political rights.
There's no neutral regime of right.
Yeah, which is neutral with respect to secondary goods. The
Yeah.
flat-footed question is, why do you think that? I saw that you were drawing a connection between this claim and the tension that you were pointing to earlier between self-construction and solidarity. That there's something there that explains why it is that there's no set of rights which is neutral with respect to sectarian goods. I'm wondering if there is that connection.
Well, how can I demonstrate that there's no neutral framework of right? That is, seems to me what we have to do is take every single candidate for such a role and inspect it, examine it, and say, no, it pretends to be neutral, but it's not. So 19th century liberalism shaped human life in a particular direction. It encouraged some forms of experience and discouraged others. And we're going to have to repeat that exercise again and again in order then to support the suspicion or the claim that there's no neutral order. That because every set of arrangements, we could have also a more abstract or speculative discussion. We could say, all of our experience, even our most intimate experiences, like for example, the way we experience jealousy or envy, is shaped by the structure of society. We can't divide the things that are influenced by context, by the social and cultural world, and the things that are. Everything is shaped by context. Subtly or not subtly, but in some form. So all of our experiences on the line in history. And this is one of the complications in politics, that when we propose a transformation in a particular direction, we're proposing a transformation of ourselves. That the human experience cannot be separated from its institutional context. So that would be the speculative defense of this idea that there's no neutral framework. But I think the speculative defense is inadequate. It has to be backed up by a reiterated practice in which we take one by one all the supposed candidates for neutrality, and we demonstrate in that particular circumstance that they're not in fact neutral.
Okay, but sorry, can I ask a
Yes.
follow-up? Just so I can get clear about the dialectic. These economic and political rights that you're thinking of that are not neutral, are they more like, substantive rights, like rights to health and certain amounts of welfare and whatnot? Or do you have in mind
No,
other
that's not what's ordinarily invoked by the classical liberals as examples of neutrality. They would say the classical rights of contract and property, which form the architecture of the private order, are the first order candidates for these neutral arrangements. And then I would say, but they're not neutral at all. This is a particular form of materialistic privatism that developed in the West. So, and you could ask, for example, it's the principle of the European novel, is accumulation. Why does Robinson Crusoe accumulate stuff on his island in this form of private property? He accumulates stuff so as not to depend on people. So this is one of the secrets of the private economy in this traditional form. The whole purpose is as an alternative to social solidarity. The reason for private accumulation is to diminish our dependence on other people. That's why Robinson Crusoe accumulates. But nevertheless, at the end, after many years of accumulation and trading, he feels lonely. And he has to return to England to the company of his countrymen. So something is wrong. And this wasn't a neutral experience. It was shaping a particular form of experience, and it is discounting something else that is precious to us. That's the kind of basic argument about neutrality. But I tried to be open about it and fallibilist. And that was the argument that I made, that nevertheless, this false and dangerous idea of neutrality is kindred to a valid idea. It has a valid form. The valid form is to say, neutrality is an illusion, but there's something like it which we must appreciate and seek. And that's this openness to a large range of contradictory experience. And then combined with corrigibility. So we're not neutral, but so long as we have many alternatives around us, and so long as we're not imprisoned in the present form, but we have a chance of revising it, then we can make up for this loss of the illusion of neutrality. If, on the other hand, we insist on the idea of neutrality, what we're likely to do is to take some particular form and in the name of neutrality, entrench it, immunize it against attack and criticism. And then we're going to have the opposite of neutrality. Because we're going to make the system less capacious, less open, less capable of doing justice to the goods that it excluded in its earlier form. Yes, just one more question.
You spoke a little bit on the biases of our Constitution, and I was wondering, do you see the creation of a high-energy democracy as something that could happen under the U.S. Constitution, or does it require a rejection?
No, I don't believe that it can. I think it can begin under the U.S. Constitution, but I don't think that it can conclude or finish under the U.S. Constitution. In that, I have one of the founders on my side, Thomas Jefferson. He thought the same thing, much more radically. Huh? So, and this is a feature of the American culture, which is important to understand in this discussion, which I didn't mention. So, one of the characteristics of American culture is this experimentalism about everything, about practical things, tinkering. But the Americans have made an exception. And the exception is the exemption that they accord to their institutions against the experimentalist impulse. So what happened in the United States is that there was a long line of American thinkers, from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey, who tried to persuade their fellow citizens to lift this exemption and subject the institutions to the same experimentalism that they applied to everything else, but they failed. And so that's part of then the framework or the background to this discussion that we had here today. Well, every single theme that I touched on will come back in many different forms.